There is a moment that tends to arrive quietly, almost without ceremony. When a person looks at a bank balance, an annual salary, or a round number like $100,000 and feels that it should mean something larger than it does. From a distance, that figure appears to represent stability, competence, even a kind of personal arrival, because it sits in the mind as a threshold rather than a number. And thresholds carry emotional force. They divide life into before and after, struggle and security, anxiety and control. Yet when people actually approach that level of income, savings, or net worth, many discover that the change is real but not absolute, meaningful but incomplete, powerful in some areas, and strangely limited in others. That disappointment can be confusing because the number itself was never only financial, it was symbolic. It stood for relief, for freedom from low-level stress, for the end of having to calculate every decision through the lens of immediate cost. The surprise is not that 100,000 changes everything. The surprise is that it changes everything in a narrower, more psychological way than most people expect. What this number changes first is not your external life in some cinematic sense, but your mental posture toward time, risk, and uncertainty. Below a certain financial threshold, the mind becomes short horizon by necessity. It is not irrational, and it is not a sign of poor character. It is adaptation. When rent, debt payments, medical costs, transportation, groceries, and minor emergencies compete for the same limited pool of resources, attention narrows. The future still matters, but the present becomes loud. A person in this state may understand compound growth, long-term investing, emergency funds, and the logic of patience, yet still struggle to act on those ideas consistently because money under pressure is not just arithmetic. It is bandwidth. It determines how much room the mind has to think beyond the next bill, the next repair, the next unexpected charge. In that environment, the cost of being wrong feels enormous, even when the numbers are small on paper, because there is no cushion to absorb error. That is why 100,000 matters. Whether we are talking about annual income, liquid savings, or even the psychological impact of crossing 6 figures in net worth, the number often marks a shift from rentier survival thinking toward strategic thinking. Not because it makes someone wealthy in any universal sense, and not because it solves structural problems built into modern economies, but because it can create the first meaningful margin. Margin is what changes behavior. Margin is the distance between a problem and a crisis. Margin is what allows a broken appliance to remain an inconvenience rather than becoming a chain reaction. Margin is what lets a person compare options instead of accepting the first available one under pressure. Once margin appears, the brain starts operating differently. Decisions become less reactive. Delayed rewards become more tolerable. The future stops feeling abstract and begins to feel reachable. To understand why this matters so deeply, it helps to separate wealth from income and both from financial stress. A person earning $100,000 in a high-cost city with major obligations can feel stretched. A person with $100,000 in savings and low monthly expenses can feel calmer on a much lower income. Another person may cross $100,000 in net worth and still feel uncertain because most of that value is tied up in retirement accounts or property, rather than accessible cash. So the threshold is not magical, and it does not work the same way for everyone. What it often signals, however, is the beginning of optionality. Optionality is one of the most underestimated forms of wealth because it does not announce itself dramatically. It shows up in the ability to wait, to negotiate, to say no, to recover, to avoid bad deals, and to think in seasons instead of days. Consider the monthly math that defines so much of modern financial life. If someone earns a modest income, perhaps after taxes, their money arrives already committed. Housing takes the first share, then transportation, utilities, food, insurance, debt, subscriptions, family obligations, and basic friction costs that seem small individually, but relentless in aggregate. By the end of the month, there may be nothing left to allocate intentionally. In that world, financial education often lands as moral pressure rather than practical help. Save more, invest earlier, cut expenses, think long-term. The advice is not always wrong, but it can ignore the reality that optimization requires surplus. When there is no surplus, every improvement must come from sacrifice, and sacrifice has a psychological limit. This is why small emergencies become expensive. This is why late fees, interest, overdrafts, rushed purchases, and fragile planning tend to cluster around lower levels of financial margin. Poverty is not only expensive because prices are high. It is expensive because flexibility is low. Now imagine the math begins to change. Not extravagantly, but enough. Instead of ending each month at zero, there is some remainder. Instead of every surprise being financed by credit, some can be handled directly. Instead of choosing only between bad options, better timing becomes possible. That is where the six-figure threshold begins to reshape the inner experience of money. The most important effect is not status. It is reduced sensitivity to small shocks. When a system is fragile, tiny disturbances create large consequences. When a system has reserves, those same disturbances are absorbed. Human psychology works the same way. Financial reserves do not remove stress from life, but they reduce the amplification effect that turns ordinary problems into emotional emergencies. This is also why people sometimes misread what they are really seeking. They say they want more money, but often what they want is to stop feeling financially cornered. Those are related goals, but they are not identical. A person can increase income and remain cornered if lifestyle, debt structure, housing choices, or social expectations rise at the same pace. This is where the threshold becomes dangerous as well as useful, because six figures carries social meaning. It invites comparison. It suggests that a person should now live differently, dress differently, travel differently, upgrade housing, upgrade their car, upgrade their routines, and quietly demonstrate progress in visible ways. The problem is that visible upgrades consume invisible freedom. A larger apartment may feel like success, but it can also replace financial oxygen with fixed cost. A more expensive car can trade social validation for reduced resilience. When income rises, the market immediately presents new ways to convert flexibility back into obligation. This pattern is not new. History is full of households, merchants, professionals, and even entire classes of people who appeared prosperous while becoming structurally fragile. In many periods of urban growth, from trading cities to industrializing economies to modern service-based societies, there has been a recurring tension between income appearance and true balance sheet strength. Periods of rising wages or expanding credit often create an illusion that a population has become more secure, when in reality, the margin for error has simply been replaced by dependence on continued inflow. As long as the money keeps arriving, the system looks stable. When the flow slows, the difference between income and resilience becomes visible immediately. This is one reason financial history matters. It reminds us that prosperity is not the same as protection, and that households often fail not because they were irresponsible in some dramatic sense, but because they built lives that assumed continuity. At the individual level, 100,000 can interrupt that pattern if it is treated as a platform rather than proof. The mistake many people make is to assume the threshold marks the end of foundational work. In reality, it often marks the beginning. Once a person can breathe financially, they face a different challenge, which is more subtle than scarcity, but just as powerful. They must decide whether additional money will purchase appearances or capacity. Capacity is less glamorous, but it changes life more deeply over time. It means building liquid reserves, reducing high-friction debt, lowering dependency on perfect monthly execution, and increasing the gap between what life costs and what life requires you to earn. That gap is the hidden engine behind financial calm. There is also a major psychological shift that tends to happen around this level, and it has to do with identity. Below certain thresholds, people often think of themselves as constantly behind, even if they are working hard and making rational choices under difficult conditions. Money becomes associated with catching up, repairing, surviving, and proving. Once some margin exists, another identity becomes possible. A person can begin to think like a steward rather than a struggler. That does not mean becoming cold, hyper-optimized, or obsessed with control. It means recognizing that money is not only something that happens to you through wages, prices, or luck. It is also a system that can be designed. Bills can be restructured. Risk can be distributed. Timelines can be lengthened. Buffers can be created. Choices can be made today that reduce the emotional cost of tomorrow. Still, it is important not to romanticize the number. 100,000 does not mean the same thing across countries, cities, family structures, health conditions, or life stages. For some people, it is far from enough to feel stable. For others, it represents a meaningful turning point. The deeper truth is that the threshold works because human beings experience money in relative, not purely absolute terms. We respond to obligations relative to income, costs relative to reserves, and uncertainty relative to our ability to absorb it. A six-figure number becomes powerful when it changes those relationships. It becomes disappointing when it changes only the top line while the underlying system remains brittle. This is why behavioral economics offers such a useful lens. People do not make financial decisions in a vacuum. They respond to stress, framing, social norms, loss aversion, immediate rewards, and the emotional residue of past instability. Someone who spent years in financial uncertainty may continue to feel poor long after objective conditions improve because the nervous system does not update as quickly as the spreadsheet. Another person may begin earning more and rapidly normalize higher spending because the mind adapts upward just as quickly as it adapts downward. In both cases, the threshold changes reality before it changes perception. That delay matters. It means crossing a number is not enough. The internal model has to change too. One of the clearest signs that a financial threshold has genuinely changed your life is not that you spend more freely, but that you think less frantically. You stop checking balances with the same pulse of dread. You stop treating every delayed payment, every repair, every scheduling mistake as a threat to your entire month. You become better at distinguishing inconvenience from danger. That distinction is more valuable than it sounds, because fear distorts judgment. It pushes people toward short-term solutions that are expensive in the long run, and toward emotional decisions that feel relieving in the moment but worsen structural weakness later. Calm is not just a feeling purchased by money. It is a decision-making advantage created by buffer. From there, the math becomes more favorable in quiet ways. If you have savings, you can avoid expensive debt. If you avoid expensive debt, more future income stays yours. If more future income stays yours, building reserves becomes easier. If reserves become easier to build, your tolerance for volatility improves. Over time, this creates a compounding effect that is partly financial and partly psychological. The money compounds because fewer leaks drain the system. The confidence compounds because experience teaches you that not every problem must be solved with urgency. This is the hidden reason thresholds matter. They alter the feedback loops that shape a person's choices. And yet the larger system remains in the background. Housing markets, healthcare costs, wage stagnation in some sectors, expanding subscription economies, social pressure, easy credit, and increasingly professionalized consumption all influence what 100,000 can actually do. The economy does not simply reward discipline, it also taxes inattention. It monetizes convenience, urgency, identity, and aspiration. That means financial progress is not only about earning more, it is about understanding the mechanics designed to convert increased income into increased dependency. The person who recognizes this begins to see money less as a score and more as a flow system with gates, leaks, thresholds, and pressure points. That perspective changes the emotional meaning of the number. 100,000 stops being a trophy and becomes a question. What does this level of money allow me to stabilize? What forms of fragility can it remove? Which obligations are worth keeping, and which are simply expensive symbols? Where does added income create real freedom, and where does it quietly create maintenance? These are better questions than whether the threshold feels impressive. Impressive is social. Stable is structural. And structure lasts longer than impression. In the end, 100,000 changes everything, because it can change the way a person relates to uncertainty, and uncertainty sits underneath almost every financial emotion. It can loosen the grip of monthly survival, widen the planning horizon, and make patience more realistic. It can reduce the cost of mistakes, increase the quality of decisions, and shift identity from reactive to intentional. But it only does this fully when it is used to create margin instead of merely displaying progress. The threshold is powerful not because it proves you have won some economic game, but because it can give you the first real chance to stop playing every round in emergency mode. That is the quiet lesson hidden inside numbers like this. Money matters, but often not in the spectacular way people imagine. It matters because beyond a certain point, it changes the texture of thought. It lets the future enter the room. It lowers the emotional volume of ordinary life. It makes restraint less painful and planning less theoretical. It does not remove risk, and it does not place anyone outside the wider economic system. But it can create a pocket of autonomy inside that system. And autonomy is one of the rarest financial assets of all. The true value of a threshold is not what it says about your status. It is what it does to your options, your time horizon, and your relationship with fear. Once you see that clearly, the number becomes less mythical and more useful, which is perhaps the most important financial shift a person can make.